Hey everybody, I'm Eric Mueller, and welcome back to the Eric Mueller Show. Now this Thursday is a very special day. Today marks the 20th episode of the podcast, as well as the start of the NFL football season. We got Thursday Night Football tonight, folks. We got the Buccaneers, reigning Super Bowl champs, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. Now I thought it'd be really fun to celebrate this day by talking about something that even the most casual football fan can appreciate, and that is fantasy football. You know, honestly, sometimes people that join leagues aren't even football fans at first, and it's what gets them into football, which I just love that. But let's talk a little bit about the history of fantasy football. You know, if I said, hey, guess when fantasy football was created, I bet you have a number in your mind somewhere in the 1980s, somewhere in the 1990s, somewhere when you think, okay, the internet was created roughly around that era. It's got to be then. Well, it might surprise you to know that it actually was started much earlier than that. It traces back to the early 60s. A man by the name of Bill Winkenbach is the one that created fantasy football. Now, he was part owner of the Oakland Raiders at the time, and he gathered a group of friends together and decided that, hey, let's do a draft, drafting players that are actual players on real football teams. Let's create fake fantasy teams with these players, set up a scoring system, and then compete against one another using the performances of those players in their actual real-time games. Add some excitement to the games. How genius is that? I can't believe that it started that early, and it really, to me, as you might recall, my favorite team is the Minnesota Vikings. My team started during that time, in 1961. So when Bill Winkenbach created fantasy football in 1962, I mean, that just, to me, it's just crazy that it could have started that long ago when some teams were still entering the league. Now, you know, other NFL teams have been around for a lot longer than that even. You know, the early 1900s and 1920, that era of time when you have the original teams that started, you know, what at that time was the National Football League that we know now. But to just think that fantasy has that long of a history is to me, I think makes it even more cool that it's become so mainstream. So in the late 90s, around 1997 is when it actually really started to gain traction in the mainstream. You started to have websites like CBS Sports that had fantasy leagues online, and the casual mainstream fans were really able to start doing that. And over time, I kind of think it took a March Madness approach, honestly, where people that really weren't even football fans started to get involved with it with their friends, started to think, hey, I can win some money doing this potentially, and it really just exploded. So I think that's a healthy place to start with this conversation, is to just talk about the rich history of that and how long ago it started. Now I really want to dive in and just talk about the basics of it. So this conversation really is designed for both the casual and the really hardcore fantasy football player, because we're going to be talking about aspects that both can understand. So really the basics here. So when you set up a fantasy football league, you first need to find out where to host that league. So a lot of the big sites, ESPN, Yahoo, CBS Sports, they have really great systems to set up the league. They have ways to help you run it if you are the league commissioner. And I really think I've used both of them. I think ESPN is really great. That's the one that's my go-to for setting up leagues. The league that I actually have going on for the podcast right now is through ESPN. So if you're in that, best of luck to you. I hope that you win that Amazon gift card and some of the podcast swag. But if you're setting up a league for your friends, and we're at Thursday today, so hey, this episode's coming out early in the morning on Thursday. If you're going to start a league, go on ESPN or Yahoo, set it up right now, get some buddies, draft before Thursday Night Football starts, and be a part of this fantasy football season. It's going to be fun. You will enjoy it. So when you set up a league, you're going to have to decide how many teams you want to be a part of that. I'd say a pretty common number to have in a league is 10, but I've seen anywhere from 8 to 20, honestly. The sweet spot really is between 10 and 14 teams. That's really where you can get, you know, a really wholesome draft where you have a lot of the best players that are spread out throughout the league. 8, you kind of have stacked teams where everybody has really, really good players. Anything more than 14, it starts to get pretty thin. You start to have lineups that really don't have a lot of boom to them, and it's not as much fun in that way. So I think a 10 or 12 team league is ideal. So if you can find, 9 or 11 of your buddies to join you, you'll be in the sweet spot for that. But so you find out, okay, we want to set it up on ESPN. We've got 10 people that we want to be a part of it. I'm the commissioner. I'm going to set up the league. Now what do I do? So now you're going to want to set a draft time. So I think truly, I know people that draft way early in the season and way late. And I think the later the better, because you have the regular NFL draft, the real thing where NFL teams draft their rookies coming out of college. That happens in April. So if you're running a fantasy football league, I would suggest not having your draft until at least August, because so much happens between the actual NFL draft and the preseason and camps of the actual NFL teams. So much can change with the players that they're rostering and how things are shaking out. There could be trades. So the leagues that I run the draft really late in the year, like late August or early September. I'm in a couple other leagues. They run them a little closer to the start of the season even, the week of the season. I think as long as you're in before Thursday night, the first game, that's perfect. So I'd say maybe a week or two before the season starts is the best way to do it. So you lock in a date. So now okay, we got this 10-team league. We're hosting on ESPN. We're going to draft on Thursday before the season starts. So we'll give ourselves 1 week. So now you might be thinking, how do we set up this draft? Like what is the order? Or how do I know what the picks are going to be or who goes where? So ESPN will offer you, and all the sites primarily will offer you basically two big options. So you have a snake draft, snake as in slithering little creature, or an auction draft. So the snake draft is really simple. The snake draft is what I would probably recommend you use. The snake draft, you have, let's say, picks 1 through 10 here. Let's say you're drafting first. So you'll make your first pick, and then they'll get all the way to pick 10, and then the person that picked first actually flips to the last pick in the second round. So you pick first in the first round, you're going to pick last in the second round. So you're going to pick 20th, basically. So that is how a snake draft works, and it keeps flip-flopping throughout the whole draft from rounds 1 through 16 when you fill your roster, if that's the amount of players you have. The auction draft, it is a little more complicated, but we'll just briefly touch it. The auction draft, people have a certain amount of fake cash to spend on players, and you bid on them as, you announce a player's name and say, okay, Peyton Manning, and people bid what they want to bid to get that player. That's not my favorite for people that are starting off. I think it's a little bit tougher. I've actually not participated in one very recently. So I greatly prefer a draft that is either a snake, or some people just do a straight draft with the order not reversing. So you just have picks 1 through 10, then picks 11 through 20, and the order stays the same. So you'd pick first in each round if you were the first pick. So you got your league set up on ESPN. You've got the draft set in. You've got the amount of teams. You know you're going to do a snake draft. Then you might be thinking, okay, are we going to do any buy-ins? Do we want to do any payouts? A lot of leagues do have an entry fee. I think that it's fun to have a little bit on the line to have some type of prize to work towards. The promotion I'm running for the show here right now, it's just no entry fee, just giving away some free things. I think that's also fun to just get people involved. But a lot of leagues have just a small fee, $5 or $10 for people entering, and then you have a pool where first and second place might take a majority of the money, and so on and so forth. Some, the payout structure, you can do with that what you want. What you also want to think about if you're the league commissioner setting this up is how you want to structure the schedule. How many games do you want to have in the regular season? Do you want to have, a 1 or a 2 week playoff? Now, I'd say a lot of leagues will implement the division strategy where you'll have 2 divisions with 5 teams in each, and it'll kind of play out like a normal, football season in which you play teams in your division a certain amount of times, you play a couple teams outside of your division. You're not going to play everyone equally, and then there's going to be certain teams from each division that make the playoffs. I personally don't really like that. I like to do a non-division setup where you just have one big division of teams, so all 10 teams in the one division. You randomize the schedule so people play each other a certain amount of times. It should even out quite a bit if you're doing 10 teams, if you're doing an even number of teams. And you do that so everyone plays the same amount of games, and then the playoffs are determined by just who is, the first through fourth teams in those 10. It doesn't matter if you were in the division that was better and you ended up, you would have made the playoffs in the other division. It can get kind of complicated if you do the division setting. So I would say just do one big division with all your teams in there. So you got your league set up, you got the schedule, you got the draft, you figured all that out. Now it comes to the actual draft night. How do you know how to draft? What players do you select? How do you structure your team? Don't worry, I got you covered here. So most leagues, you're going to have it set up in this way. Your team is going to be a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex position, which we'll get to that, a tight end, a defense, and a kicker. So when you draft, you're going to want to fill in all these positions, but each position is not equal. So just because a quarterback, if you look at fantasy statistics, just because a quarterback scores a ton of points doesn't mean that you should prioritize them over, let's say, a running back. So if you notice, if you look at rankings, if you go on ESPN and listen to Matthew Berry and all these big names that do rankings and have a career of this, you're going to see that running backs are your main players that are ranked high in the draft. There's going to be some wide receivers, and there's even going to be some tight ends in there. Those are what we're going to call skill players. So those are the players that you're going to want to target in those early rounds. So when you're drafting, I would suggest using some type of rankings sheet, whether you use the one on ESPN. There's a fair amount of resources I'll tag in these show notes. The one I personally love to use is called FantasyPros. There's also one called Fantasy Alarm. Some of these have paid options to them, but you're going to want to have some type of ranking chart to help you out, especially if you're new to this fantasy football drafting. So once you've got your cheat sheet ready, you're ready to start drafting. So I want to give you just a couple additional pieces of advice when you're drafting your football team here. So the majority of your early round picks are going to be running backs and wide receivers. You might have a tight end or a quarterback in that mix depending on what picks fall to you, but that's what's going to make up your roster. If I could offer you one piece of advice to remember about drafting your fantasy football team, it's this. Wait as long as possible to draft a defense and a kicker. Now, I know what you're thinking. Eric, I want to fill in my roster spots. I don't want to have 12 running backs. You're not going to have that many, but I don't want to have that many running backs on my team and not have a defense or a kicker or even a quarterback. Well, you know what? Honestly, you can stream those positions throughout the season. Now, streaming is, we'll get into waivers in a little bit here, but streaming is where you're not going to have that player starting for your team all season long. There is a bye week where your player is not going to be playing. So if you have the Denver Broncos defense, there's going to be a week throughout the season where they're not even going to play a game. So you're going to have somebody else in there to fill in. You'll be able to pick up a different team and sub them in, and you may end up dropping the Denver Broncos completely. And kickers as well. So defense and kickers, they're just such wild cards. No one can really accurately predict any fantasy outcome for any player, but defenses and kickers are the most variable. So wait as long as you can on that. That's my number one piece of advice. If you notice your buddies are drafting them early, you might be forced to, but really, if you're in a 10-team league and you're doing 16 rounds, defenses should not be anywhere near coming off the board until after round 10 at the very earliest. Kickers even later than that. So that's my first piece of advice. That's the biggest piece of advice to take home with you today. The second one is to just really have fun with it. Don't overthink the draft. Don't overanalyze it. I'd say be prepared with some type of cheat sheet or some ranking system, but don't overthink it. If you're in between on some players, just throw the dart, pick one. You have a good chance of it panning out as you do of it not panning out. So just have fun with it. So when you're drafting and filling out your roster, you'll fill in those positions. You'll get running backs, wide receivers. You'll get your tight end, quarterback. You'll eventually take a defense and a kicker. And you're also going to be filling in a bunch of bench spots. So each league is going to have a certain amount of bench spots that they'll allow. Most leagues will have 8 bench spots or so, and some might have an injured reserve spot where you can place a player that is injured, and it just prevents you from dropping a player that you'd otherwise want to keep without getting rid of a roster spot. So that's how you formulate your team. So that's the typical roster setup for most leagues. Your bench, your starters. Now let's talk a little bit about the waiver wire. So you heard me mention that term waivers. So throughout each week in the season, there's going to be players that are not drafted by any team. And they're going to just be sitting on what's called the waiver wire. So if you have a player that gets injured, their backup player, in like the running back situation, you get a big running back that gets injured, their backup is probably going to be a hot waiver wire pick. So the way the waiver wire works in most leagues, we'll give you 2 examples here of the ways you can set up the waiver. In most leagues, the traditional waiver wire setup is you have it set to the inverse of the standings. So if I'm in a league and I win my first game and I'm sitting on the top of my rankings, I am going to have the last priority on the waivers. So if I want that player that backup that's now a hot pick, it's probably going to be really hard for me to get that because everybody else in my league is going to have higher priority. And that happens without getting down too much of a detailed rabbit hole here. After the week of football, after Sunday, after Monday night, you come to Tuesday, you're going to submit claims for players. So you're going to submit a claim saying, I want to get this backup running back. And if you're in the last position in the league, you're going to get that. In a traditional setup, you will get that player once the waiver claims submit later in that week. Usually it's Wednesday morning that those will go through. So you have about a day to submit your claims, then early Wednesday morning, those will go through, and then you'll have your player. Remember, you can only have a certain amount of players on your team. 8 starters, 8 bench spots traditionally. So you'll have to drop a player to pick up a player. But the waiver wire is key to winning a fantasy football league. You want to keep working that. You always want to keep churning players in and out of your roster. Make sure that you're not holding on to someone that's not panning out. Most leagues redraft every single year. There are leagues where you can keep certain players, but if you're in a league where you're just drafting new every year, don't hold someone that's not panning out for you, and don't hold a player that's injured or not doing their job for your team for longer than you have to. Just churn them and burn them on the waiver wire, they say. So that's traditional waiver wire setup. The other way you can set up your waiver is an FAAB, a FAB. So that stands for Free Agent Acquisition Budget. So what does that mean? Well, you remember when I was talking about an auction draft earlier where people had fictional money to bid on players? This is pretty much like that. So you're going to start with a certain amount of money at the beginning of the season, and just like you would process a waiver claim on Tuesday, you would be able to place that claim, but you would have to tie a dollar amount to it as far as what you're willing to pay for that player. Now, these websites I mentioned, FantasyPros, Fantasy Alarm, every week they're going to be publishing articles telling you how much you should wager on certain players, what percentage of your FAB budget you should wager. Just do a quick Google search for these resources. It's going to help you out immensely if you're in a FAB league. But let's use that backup running back, for example. Let's say big name Christian McCaffrey goes down with an injury like he did last year, and his backup skyrockets in value. If you have a $100 fake FAB budget, you might consider spending like 45 to 55% of that budget on that player if there's a clear indicator that they're going to be a running back number 1 on their team after an injury. So FAB, I think in more experienced leagues, that's where I would lean. I'm in a couple leagues where we do that. I think it's really fun. It adds another element of skill set to the fantasy football league. So I think that's something to explore if you're into it for a couple years. Maybe try that out. So I also want to touch on just some strategies for setting your lineup. How do you know who to start, who to sit? I'm going to go back to those resources. FantasyPros is phenomenal. They have a tool that even if you pay for it, you can add 4 players. If you don't pay for it, you can still add 2. So if you want to say, hey, should I start Dalvin Cook or Derrick Henry this week? Plug both those players in. It's going to give you a percentage of those analysts as far as who they would start. And I mean, if you're anything like me, let the professionals do the research for you. We're all busy. We've all got lives going on outside of fantasy football. So I would say let them do the research for you and make it a little bit easier on yourself throughout the year. So when you're setting your lineup, that's one resource to use. You can also use ranking sheets and figure out what ESPN thinks you should start. The projections, they're going to project a certain amount of points they think each player is going to score each week. And they're also going to give rankings per position and overall. So really, there's a ton of resources, but it all comes back to it's kind of like March Madness filling out a bracket. No one knows. No one can predict anything accurately. There's players that should do better more often, but there's really no way to know for sure. So just don't sweat it too much. Just set your lineup with the players that you think are going to do well, and if they don't, try again next week. If you're new to fantasy sports, sometimes it's kind of fun to play favorites. If you're, a Cleveland Browns fan, start Baker Mayfield as quarterback one week and just try it. Even if he's ranked, the 16th quarterback of that week, who knows? He might surprise people. He might end up to be the 3rd best quarterback that week. So don't sweat it too much. Set your lineup and have fun. Again, defenses and kickers are mostly luck. So just pick, if you drafted the Denver Broncos, start them. But if they don't pan out one week, drop them, pick up a new one, start the Pittsburgh Steelers the next week. Now, I don't want to forget to mention the importance of the flex position. So the flex spot, if you recall from the lineup, you're going to have one flex position. So in most leagues, this player can be a running back, a wide receiver, or a tight end that you don't have in one of the other slots. So if you have Dalvin Cook in your running back slot, you can't also have him in the flex, but you could have a different running back in Dalvin's space and put Dalvin in the flex. I like to use the flex in this way. I like to make my flex player the latest game of the week, if possible. So if you have someone playing Sunday or Monday night, put them in your flex spot so that if something happens and they get injured, you can quickly add a different player into your lineup and you don't have to worry about what position they are. Let me say that one more time so it makes sense, because I know in my mind it's super simple, but for people that are new to fantasy, you can only put a running back in a running back spot. But you can put anybody that's a running back, wide receiver, or tight end in the flex spot. So don't limit yourself by putting someone in that flex spot that plays really early, because then if someone else gets injured that's a running back and you want to sub in a wideout, now you can't do that. So that's a way to use the flex spot, and also your flex player, it's going to be someone that should have a pretty high amount of upside, and don't really worry about if they're very consistent on a weekly basis. Ideally they will be, but if you have a team where you have a flex spot that's just a very high upside guy, that's going to pan out for you as well. So I want to talk a little bit about scoring. So you might see these terms thrown out when you're looking at league setups: PPR, half PPR, and standard. So PPR just stands for points per reception. Half PPR is just, half points per reception. So running backs and wide receivers, when they catch a pass, that will score them a point in a PPR, and a half point in a half PPR. So this is really important when you think about players that are pass-catching running backs, or, obviously tight ends and wideouts catch passes almost exclusively, but that's something to consider. I really like a PPR because it's a little higher scoring. It favors some of the pass-catching running backs that are kind of the new age running backs in my mind. A guy like Derrick Henry is kind of a bruiser. He doesn't catch a lot of balls out of the backfield, but your Alvin Kamara's, your Dalvin Cooks, people that are, even Christian McCaffrey catches quite a bit of balls. And I think that is one way to increase the scoring, and also, I think, make your league more fun if you do PPR. That's just my opinion. Other than that, I don't really want to get into scoring too much because that can get pretty complicated. Most passing touchdowns are worth less than scoring touchdowns, and it can be a little confusing, but if a quarterback throws a touchdown pass, it's not going to be worth as much as if the quarterback would have ran the ball into the end zone themselves. But if you're setting up a league, just look at those settings and play around with those as you wish. Very customizable. I think a bigger piece to talk about is really playoffs. How do you want to set up playoffs? Do you want it to be a 1-week playoff matchup or a 2-week? So a lot of leagues I've seen will set it up where if you make the playoffs, you will play that same team that you're playing against for 2 weeks straight, and it's going to take the combined score. I think that's really fun. I think that makes it a lot more fun for the casual fan too, because if I get blown out in the first week of the playoffs and I'm out, bummer. If I have another week to come back potentially, even if it's a long shot, that makes it more fun for me to still stay and watch those games if I'm a casual sports fan and don't really care about the actual teams. So that's my opinion, to make it 2 weeks, but I'm in leagues where it's just one. It's fun both ways. I think it just makes me go back to the division setup and just think, why would I want to do a division setup where I have 2 divisions? Because that limits, the ability of the playoffs to include the best teams, in my opinion. If you have a setup where you have just one division, take the 4 best teams of those 10, or the 6 best teams if you're really feeling like you want to have a big playoff pool. Playoffs usually include about 33 to 40% of the league. So it's a third to not quite half. So if you have 10 teams, having 4 of them in there is reasonable. Even a 12-team league, I would still suggest 4. 14-team, you could probably bump it up to 6. But the main point is to just decide between that 1 and 2 week playoff matchup to make sure that your whole league is on board. And as a league commissioner, I think it's important to just communicate with your members and just see what people want, and changes year to year are common. Some leagues I'm in will vote on it. Some leagues, the commissioner is kind of just in charge of changing things and just making sure nobody is mad about it. But yeah, that's kind of the basic setup of a league, and quickly going over scoring. So on a week-to-week basis, the team that scores the most points will win that game. Although it is possible to tie, it's pretty unlikely. There's ways to set up tiebreakers for that, but I really don't think you need to worry about that. Tie is really not going to happen very often. But the team that scores the most points will get the win in their win column, and it'll go on to the next week. So the playoffs is determined by those records of those teams. If a tiebreaker was to arise in terms of the overall league, that's when I think you want to set it to be head-to-head record. So if I played my friend Derek's team 2 times throughout the season, and he beat me both times, even if I have the same record as Derek, he's going to bump me and he's going to get into the playoffs. So I think setting that, and you'll find that in playoff tiebreakers, head-to-head is going to be a setting you'll want to pick, I think. Otherwise, it'll be total points for. I'm just not as big a fan of that because I don't think that really takes into account the team that you're going up against in those rankings. And if that team beat you a bunch, even if you have the same record, I think that team should get in before you. So That's just personal preference again. A lot of things with fantasy football, if you haven't already gathered, are up to you. So if you're setting up the league, set it up in the way that you want to. Just make sure your league mates are on board with it. I just want to talk just briefly about daily fantasy sports. So you probably, unless you've been living under a rock, if you watch sports, you've probably heard of things such as FanDuel and DraftKings, certain daily fantasy sports contests. Those are pretty fun. Honestly, those are a good time. There's a way to enter them without having to pay money. There's a way to do free contests. If you're not into gambling, I would suggest trying that out. If you are into gambling, there are promos that these sites run. You can get bonuses for signing up as a new user. I'm not endorsing gambling by any means, but if you enjoy doing that, it's a pretty fun way to throw your hat in the ring to win some cash, to play the lottery, so to speak. So briefly, if you're doing daily fantasy sports, the big difference is going to be between what they call cash games and what they call GPPs, or guaranteed prize pools. So in cash games, just to touch on it very shortly, cash games, you're going to want to pick players in your daily team that have a very high floor. They have very high consistency of scoring a certain amount of points on a week-to-week basis. You're not trying to hit a really big home run with this lineup. You're just trying to get very consistent production to beat out the players in the pool that you're in. And in a cash game, it's going to be a small amount of players. You're not going to be playing against millions of people. In a GPP, you're going to want to pick a more unconventional lineup. So you're going to want to try to hit some home runs. You're going to want to pick players that are a little bit more high upside and a little bit lower floor. So you're going to pick a guy like a Will Fuller from previous years. So Will Fuller, he's a wide receiver. He's been known to be a boom or a bust type guy. One week he might score 50 points. The next week he might score none. He might go negative because he caught a pass and fumbled the ball. So in the GPPs, you're going to want to pick players like that because although you're entering that pool with thousands of players, most of these contests have 100,000 plus people playing in it, and the grand prize is maybe $500,000 or $1 million. And you're not going to win that if you use those consistent high floor players because you're not going to win it as often, I should say. So you're going to want to pick those players that have very high upside to have a very off chance of hitting that big lineup for you to win that contest. So cash games, GPPs, if you look into daily fantasy sports, you're going to hear that terminology. Just wanted to give you a little rundown of that. And I want to wrap up the episode now. So I really hope that you've enjoyed sitting with me here talking about fantasy football. It's something I'm really passionate about. You can probably hear it in my voice. This is something that's easy for me to talk about. I look forward to playing in the league with everybody that joined. I sincerely wish the best of luck to you. I hope that you win those prizes. And for even those of you that don't, there still might be something special for you on the way. So don't lose hope in that way. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Until next time, Mueller out.